water. And what happens is that these fatty acids can be incorporated into what are called phospholipids. Phospholipids are basically, you take two fatty acids, attach them to sort of like a backbone, and then attach some sort of head group that likes water. And these are essentially the building blocks of all membranes in our cells, along with cholesterol. Cholesterol is another lipid. It's quite a bit different in terms of its structure, but it's basically similar in that it can also be incorporated into membranes and influence rigidity. So if I were to sort of summarize that, lipids, for the most part, make up membranes, and they provide sort of like a separation between the inside of the cell, or different compartments within the cell, from the outside. There, those membranes can concentrate certain metabolic reactions. So certain parts of the cells will have certain things synthesized in them. Membranes can help with sorting, whether certain proteins associate with a particular part of a membrane, certain compartments. But lipids are also spectacular in that they can also be what are called secondary messengers in signal transduction pathways in cells. Cells actually have these really complex networks of signaling, which basically tell the cell to respond to some sort of external stimulus, or even something that's changed within the cell. A cell can react. Certain lipids, they can be part of membranes, but then an enzyme can come along and cleave a lipid, and that lipid can then interact with another molecule downstream in the signal pathway, and that can amplify a signal. It's very, very multi-purpose.
Interesting. So, what the lipids' role in these cancer cells that can detach and survive, is it just the sheer fortitude of the membrane of the cancer cell that's allowing it to sustain itself when it's not detached, or
possibly? So, when in the case of phosphatidylcholine is a phospholipid. It's got two fatty acid chains, and it's got what's called a phosphate group, and then attached to what's called a choline. Choline is a very abundant nutrient that was pretty easy to get. So the idea of preventing phospholipid biosynthesis is essentially, it's assumed that this phospholipid is its synthesis is regulated by processes that influence cell division. But it's kind of there's a bit of back and forth, I think, between whether the cell is going to divide or not, whether this process will be upregulated. So say the cell wants to divide, certain molecules will regulate the upregulation of phosphatidylcholine biosynthesis. But the cells, if can't synthesize this lipid, the cancer cells might die. We don't actually know this for sure, though. There's evidence for this, but in the case of what we're witnessing, we don't really know if that's what's happening. We do know, for example, if a cancer cell detaches from either other cells or whatnot, or in a basement membrane, we know there's evidence that this lipid synthesis is upregulated. So cancer cells want to synthesize this lipid, but it's unclear whether this is because it just needs membranes for whatever reason for cell division. That's what we're trying to find out. We think the lipid itself is crucial for the cancer cell survival. And I've seen evidence myself. When you deprive the cells of the ability to synthesize this lipid, the cells go from being nice and spread out on a dish to becoming very, very small. And cells have a region called the nucleus where they store DNA. All the genomic material is generally stored here. The nucleus is normally a nice big sphere, but when you deprive the cells of this enzyme, what happens? I shouldn't say just this enzyme, but the ability to synthesize this lipid. The nuclei begin to become almost crescent-shaped. There seems to be a drastic change in cellular morphology that suggests that either the cells are dying or going into some sort of inactive state. We haven't really figured out what's going on there. Part of my project has been looking at the regulation of a particular enzyme that synthesizes phosphatidylcholine. This enzyme, normally, it doesn't really do anything. It's kind of inactive in this nuclear compartment, and you can actually see it if you stain with antibodies. Antibodies are basically tools that we use to specifically tag proteins, and then these have a fluorescent signal that you can detect when you look at them under a microscope. And we can see that normally this enzyme is just diffuse in the nucleus. It's not really doing anything. But when you actually stress the cells out in particular ways, this enzyme suddenly begins to form this sort of ring structure all around the nucleus. It's translocating. Rather than being nice and diffuse, it begins to associate with the nuclear membrane. So that's kind of what I'm focusing on right now, is trying to understand why that happens and why it seems to happen so much more readily in the cancer cells I've looked at than the non-cancer cells. It's really, at this point, it's kind of a exploratory. We don't really have a good understanding of it.
Man, it sounds like so much shit's going on such an incredibly small scale. Just like so, like our sheer survival is so dependent on just the activities of these incredibly small, little, self-contained, almost ecosystems that are reproducing and killing each other, and you know, just attacking disease and staying alive and doing whatever it is all these cells are doing. Like, it just keeps blowing my mind, the sheer complexity of the whole situation.
Yeah.
But so you were mentioning cholesterol, and I feel like there's probably a lot of confusion and misinformation or anything else of the sort about cholesterol. You said it was a what exactly was it? It was a type of lipid, right?
Yeah.
So is there like? So I'm sure like your body needs cholesterol to do certain things, but it gets like it's like anything else, right? With everything needs moderation, and if it gets out of control, it's like when people get issues. Or maybe if you could speak on cholesterol a little bit.
So I guess what I would first say about cholesterol is it's what cholesterol we study in our lab in particular for its role in its both in how it is involved in membrane integrity, I guess you might say, and how it's trafficked through the cell. I think that would be a good way of looking at it. There's also some research being done in our lab looking at how it's trafficked not just in the cell, but perhaps from the intestine and then through your blood. Basically, cholesterol is insoluble in water, so you have to basically package it in what's called a lipoprotein. And the intestines do this, and then they send it into the lymphatics, or in some cases you have it sent from the liver in these lipoproteins. That's a bit outside of my area of expertise. But I can say that there is a lot of misconceptions, I think, perhaps about these lipoproteins and what certain ratios of different lipoproteins can mean for your health. But basically, cholesterol's primary role, as far as I understand it, is to control cell membrane rigidity. As you increase the cholesterol content in your membranes, it can influence how rigid a membrane is. If you don't have a lot of cholesterol, the membranes are more fluid-like. And basically, cholesterol achieves this by embedding itself and sort of intercalating between phospholipids.
What would a phospholipid be?
So phosphatidylcholine, what I was telling you about earlier.
Okay.
So phospholipids are basically the most abundant lipid in membranes. And then you have cholesterol and a few other membrane lipids that are like phospholipids. So phospholipids, when they associate with each other and form these lipid bilayers that make up the membranes, they're very fluidic. They're not like this rigid structure, but cholesterol can contribute to making the membranes more rigid. Now, where cholesterol goes from having a structural function to having more of a pathological function is when you have these lipoproteins that contain cholesterol esters that basically accumulate in these regions of your arteries that are I think the current consensus is that you have like an injury in your arteries, and you have sort of an immune response where these white blood cells are infiltrating into your arteries, and they take up this cholesterol, these cholesterol-containing particles, and they what's unclear is what exactly happens next, but I think it's generally considered that these white blood cells oxidize the cholesterol, and all this cholesterol just builds up in these cells until they die, and it releases all sorts of nasty immune activating compounds that just kind of triggers more white blood cells to come, and it just creates a bit of a mess, and you get what's called atherosclerosis. But it's still very controversial. I don't know enough about it, unfortunately, to really give much of an opinion outside of the immunology of it, like looking at the white blood cells involved and stuff like that. But when it comes to the actual cholesterol side of things, it's it's not necessarily dietary cholesterol. Dietary cholesterol can influence your blood cholesterol, but there's basically cholesterol is only synthesized when you have an abundance of energy. So if you have a lot of calories or something like that, you're going to have more cholesterol being synthesized in your liver. And
so if you're like living a sedentary life and taking in way too much food, not spending it, then it's more likely that. Or does it depend on the food on top of that?
I think so. I mean, there's like evidence that with high carb diets, you have certain, I guess I would say, sort of signaling pathways in your cells that over time become, I don't know if I'd say inhibited, but like changed in response to a consistent amount of insulin signaling, because if you take in a lot of carbohydrates, you get peaks of insulin into your blood to help clear the higher the blood glucose, and this is associated with over time insulin resistance, and as you continue to spike your body with high amounts of glucose and whatnot, this can lead to changes in the way your body can utilize calories, and whatnot. But admittedly, I don't know enough about that to say too much confidently. When it comes to cholesterol, my understanding though is that essentially, if you have an abundance of energy, cholesterol will be synthesized in the liver. Sometimes this can be to produce byproducts of cholesterol, like cholesterol can be converted into bile acids, can help deal with solubilizing fats in your digestive system and helping them not actually be taken up but actually excreted. But it also can be taken from the liver to other parts of the body, because parts of your body need cholesterol. Your liver needs to be giving your cells in the body cholesterol. It needs to deliver it, because the rest of your body doesn't really, as I understand it, doesn't really synthesize a whole heck of a lot of cholesterol. It's mostly in your liver. One of the problems is if you get a lot of certain lipoproteins, like what's called low-density lipoprotein. Low-density lipoprotein carries a lot of cholesterol, but also a lot of other lipids, and it takes the cholesterol to the body from the liver. And then you have what's called high-density lipoproteins, which sort of have reverse transport of cholesterol from the tissues back to the liver, where it can be dealt with. And my understanding is there's issues with atherosclerosis, and if you have higher LDL to HDL, it increases the risk of cholesterol esters building up in your arteries and getting these plaques that form that can eventually be ruptured, and it can cause clotting, occlusion of blood vessels. It can be very dangerous if you're older and you live a sedentary lifestyle. Your risk goes through the roof for it. But,
it seems like a lot of things. Like, how bad, in your estimation, is a sedentary lifestyle? It sounds like, to me, it's just the worst possible thing.
Yeah, I think, as opposed to talking about cholesterol, which I don't really know much about. When it comes to just having read about the risks of sedentary lifestyle, I know 100%. If you look at cultures that are, less active, you just see a huge increase in all sorts of problems with, metabolic syndrome, obesity, diabetes, and of course diet plays a role. There's no doubt about it. Especially when you think about our culture here, where there's so much junk food being consumed, high fructose corn syrup containing pop. That's my vice, and it's just so terrible for you. And if you have this terrible diet and you're not active, I mean, it's a perfect storm for developing metabolic syndrome, obesity, diabetes. Things that we can manage in our current society to an extent, but as you get older, it can really affect your quality of life to an extent that
Well, I remember my grandmother, her, she passed. What was it? I think it was 2 winters ago.
She